I'm Kupillas, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me. I teach a lot. I'm based in Long Beach. I teach on Zoom and in person at the Art Supply Warehouse, and I'm a volunteer teacher for the OLLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Program, which is for seniors or 50 and over through Cal State Long Beach, and I've been teaching there for over 3 years. I brought some examples of my work here, and and all of them utilize Viviva. So I was pitching Viviva before they ever made me an ambassador, because I found out about the colors, the watercolors on Instagram, you know, during the pandemic when we were all looking for online classes and things to do, and I just kept seeing this Viviva colors, and they were so bright, and I was so interested in them. So I was using them and started to teach classes at Art Supply Warehouse on how to use them. And then I got in touch with them at one point for something else, to sponsor the Back Bay Festival for SoCal Papa, the planer group I belong to with Fletcher and some of the other folks here. And they asked me if I'd be an ambassador. So I am, so I'm excited about that. It didn't change my life very much. I still use them in the same way, but I do like showing other people the benefits of them. So and what they are really highly pigmented watercolor dyes. They're actually food dyes, which means they're non-toxic, which is great for me because I'm a plein air painter. I like to go outside as much as I like to paint in the studio. And when you dump your water, it's not toxic. There's nothing toxic in it. So what they are, and this is a used set, you'll excuse me, so it's kind of messy, but they are painted in layers onto sheets, and they're allowed to dry. So they're extremely heavily pigmented dyes that are painted, allowed to dry, and then painted another layer and another layer in the same manner. So what you get on just one of these squares is the equivalent of a half pan of watercolor, those little squares. So it's the same amount. Not quite as much as the tube, but if you've ever seen like those tiny tubes of watercolor, it's about the same amount if you use them properly. So when I first discovered them, I used them the wrong way, and I depleted them way too soon, and I kind of trashed them. They come in these travel sets of 16 colors, and I started with an original set, but now they have a metallic set and a fall set and a spring set, and they're really fun. They come out with new things with new colors. So within each of the new sets, there'll be a couple of the standard colors, and then they'll have new colors. So what you have is you have these sort of painted on blocks of color, and then they're separated by a sheet of cellulose so that the colors don't mix with each other. So they can be activated with water, and I'll show you how to do it, and then you have these sheets for safety so they don't mix with each other. So this is how I learned about them and how I first started painting with them, and I thought they were great. I could just chuck them into like a plastic Ziploc bag with a brush or a water pen, and then, you know, binder clip it onto my sketchbook, and I could go anywhere with it. So I love that. And I mostly use them for sketching. Like I do pencil or ink, and then I'd fill in some color. But as I've sort of gotten away from doing pen and ink sketching and gone more, I went full on into watercolor about 5 years ago. I've been using them more in a fine art way. So I've been incorporating them into my paintings, and I'll show you guys how I use them rather than just talk about it. How's that? So what I do is I wet a brush, and then I start in the corner because there's a lot of pigment on here, and I used to start in the middle, and then I would be sort of abrading the paper and ruining the color too fast. There's so many layers on here that you only need a little tiny bit. So if you start from the corner, you kind of know where you're depleting, and then you could work your way outwards. And so you just sort of reactivate this like you would with a dried watercolor in the pans. And then actually each of these little sets comes with a little palette. So I'm just gonna put a little more water on there. So look how vivid that is without, I added a little bit of water to it. So, and then I'll paint it and I'll show you guys how nice it comes out. Really beautiful. That's also a great color, and it's called crimson. It's It's really beautiful. But I'll show you even straight out of the tube. It's just like if you've ever used a dye in a bottle or a watercolor ink. It comes out like that. So you can use these straight from here without mixing them, or you can mix them. And you can mix them on the palette as given, or you can mix them like just by bringing them over here. So I love that color straight out of the sheet, let's call it, instead of straight out of the tube. But if I want to tone it down, I can use a complementary color. And usually what I would do is I would just blot this dry a little bit or blow on it. But I'm a fast painter, so I usually just turn the page. And that's why the pages, you can't reactivate the paint from the pages, so any paint that goes on here is lost, but it's a minimal amount. If you take a look at the paintings I've done over here, I brought a variety of different paintings where some of them you can tell I've used very vivid colors sort of straight out of the color chart, and other times where I've made it more realistic by mixing and blending colors to have more realism in it. So see the difference, right? So a lot of people think you can only get this with the Viva, but that is not true. You can paint as realistically as you want by just color mix, just like with any other paint. Mr. Clean Magic Eraser that you buy at the grocery store is inexpensive, and you can use this to literally erase your watercolor. So everybody told me when I took up watercolor, you can't fix a mistake. Have you guys heard that? You can't fix a mistake. It's not true. It's not easy to fix a mistake. It's much easier to correct a mistake in other media, like where you can erase it or paint over it or push the paint around on the canvas and that kind of thing. But with Mr. Clean, you literally can just take off that top layer. You have to keep turning it because otherwise you'll redeposit the color. But I just erased the bottom half of that pink, and I can get most of it off, but with the Viva, it's risky. Whereas with traditional watercolors, especially the non-staining ones, you can get almost all of it. You could literally wipe a whole page clean using Mr. Clean. So for those of you guys who've never used it, you might want to give it a try. I use it to clean up little splooches and splotches that get slung into different parts when I'm painting furiously, you know. But you can also use it to lift, or you can use it to fix an error. The only thing I would say, you have to use it with clean water. So if you use dirty water, you're just going to end up with that on the paper. And you have to watch carefully when it starts to abrade the paper. Because I think what you're really doing is lifting off the top layer of paper when you do this, right? Have you guys ever used it like on your walls? It takes some of that little paint off. So what you have to do is just watch for it. And once the paper starts to get to be wet, you have to stop because it will abrade your paper. So you stop, wait for it to dry, and then you can come back and finish the job. Okay, so I just saved you guys a whole lot of money on paper now that you know this trick. So it is a pretty awesome trick. And you can see I ripped mine up so that I have more facets. Like if I rip this up here, I've got 1 facet, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and I can just keep turning it. And so I don't, you know, that thing will last me a year. There are things that you can do with traditional watercolor paint that you can't do with a dye or an ink, and you can't get that thick mark. You can't get like that kind of a texture with anything but a tube paint, right? It's just not possible. Also, if I want to have some opacity in my work, then I need to add some color that has some more chalkiness to it. So, for example, you can see a combination of different colors used here, where I've used this more opaque buff here, and then I've also layered it in with some of these brighter colors to kind of have a balance to it. But then when I want that bright sky that I see up in the mountains, I paint up in the mountains a lot, then I'm gonna go for the Viva because it creates such beautiful, consistent color and flat washes, but it also can do some unexpected things as well. So I have a lot of fun with the Viva. Oh, and sometimes I will just use it to punch up color. So if this is the super bloom going on in October up in the mountains, and just a regular yellow wasn't gonna do it. I had to use a more vivid yellow. So I used like Hansa yellow and yellow ochre, but then on top of it, I used the Viviva yellows, and then I went in with some quinacridone gold as well. So it just kind of creates these bright, bright colors that you don't get anywhere else. This is the brand I've stuck with. Anytime you change paper, you have to relearn the drying time, how it's sized. Watercolor paper is sized, it has sizing in it like a shirt, because if it didn't have that sizing in it, it'd be like painting on a paper towel. Like the paint would just go like spoosh and spread out, and so you wouldn't have color intensity anymore, nor control. So I recommend anyone who's starting out, just start with a student grade paper like Canson or something like that, or lower grade Strathmore, and use that for swatching and studies and things. And then find one paper you like, whether it's a good Strathmore or Fabriano has a nice 100%, or Arches, and just stick with that for a while, because otherwise you're gonna be like, oh, why didn't that work? I just got a big run-in or something like that. So drying time and paper, I think, are the most important things in watercolor. So I usually take my paper down, and this might be too ambitious a size to do a quick demo on, because I paint pretty quick anyway, but I'm gonna do a quick demo. But I do like, they do offer a landscape paper. And so I think maybe I'll make this landscape by just sort of cutting the top off. What do you guys think about that as a layout? Yes? I'm looking at Fletcher. She's like, okay. All right, Fletcher. So the nice thing is you can also use the top to swatch your colors. However, I quite often will use, that's not it. I'll just use a scrap. So if I were to say have cut this, I'll have a scrap. So I know I can be quite particular, but I always use the scrap of the same paper, because I can tell how long it's going to take to dry, or I can test it for some technique. And if I'm using a different paper, oops, it's not actually going to translate the same when I'm working on it. So I always use the scrap of the same paper. So a little picky, but. And I'll just do a quick sketch. I'm not going to get too fancy. There's definitely not going to be whatever that pole is right in the middle. I'm just going to follow the contour. So you notice I'm not even like looking at the color version. I don't take colors literally. For me, it's more about the values and how the colors look together. So I'm just going to find the contour, and I'll probably just create this a little bit longer to make it more interesting, like I said. So I'll just find a peak and kind of go with that. And then I'll find another contour and just go with that. Okay, so I am going to put this peak off center, but only slightly. Okay, what do you guys think? In a classical composition, usually you have symmetry on both sides, so this is not a purely classical composition. It's a little different, okay? But I do still want to have some room for those reflections in here. So I'm just going to draw the barest of minimum. Now, when you are working with watercolors, it's important to know where your lights and darks are going to be, and especially where the lights are going to be, not to have a lot of pencil. If you have a lot of pencil line, once you paint, you can't get rid of that pencil. It's stuck there. If you're doing dark colors, who cares, because it'll cover it. But if you're using light, bright, transparent colors, your pencil is left in the painting. So I'm gonna do the sky first. And people always ask me, how do I know if I should do the sky first, or I should do the body or the land or whatever, the rest of the subject. And for me, it doesn't matter what you do. It's up to you, unless you're doing a full underpainting of the whole thing. In which case, oops, I have one clean water and one dirty water.
Yeah, the only thing that matters is you remember where that white is.
Yeah, exactly. Remember where you want your white to be. For these mountain paintings, I do the sky first because I know I'll have some white touching up to it. And then how do I say this? So if I do the land first, I might lose some of that white in the sky, like if there's any overlap or anything like that. So normally I wet with a sponge. I didn't bring one today. If you're using a super absorbent paper like Arch, or some people call it Arches, doesn't matter, you have to do 2 passes of water, because one pass will go straight into the paper, and the other pass, the second pass, is what makes sure it's really wet. Okay, then the most important thing for me is to let it dry just a little bit. So while it's drying, I can use my colors, and I can mix up a blue that I want for this guy. So I know these colors pretty well, so I know what I want to use. I'm going to use this Persian blue. Can you guys see how nice that is? So now neither of them are clean, but that's okay, because all I needed, I'm only doing this part wet on my, oh, thank you, yeah, that'd be great. But I only needed it to be clean once, so yeah, you can clean that one, thank you. So again, the most important, I don't usually do this upside down, but I'm gonna do it upside down for you, but the most important thing is just to kind of go across the top. Now, when you wet the paper, the water that's in the paper now is helping to create the blur, and that's why I won't get brush strokes. So I could do this even with a small brush, which is dangerous, but so I won't. But you can, because the paper that's wet it's going to eliminate the brush strokes. Just it's osmosis. So now I can tilt it a little or a lot. Thank you. Appreciate that.
You want to carry the towels?
Now I use a cloth right here.
Oh, exactly.
But thank you. So I just want a change in value from the sky, the top of the sky to the bottom. So I can let that drip a lot, and then you can always level it back. So if you want that, like we're gonna do that in the reflection in the water, but you can always level it back and forth. You can even go side to side. And something I always do is I always miss the corners. Terrible at it. I know this about myself, though, at least. So I can take this and I can blot a little bit. So if I don't really want that to go down all the way, I want to leave some white there. If I blot it just a little bit, and you can use tissue, but I try to not use a lot of tissue. So I can kind of get that there. And then that last little bit that isn't quite touching the mountain, I can just sort of blend it down a little bit. See how nice the Viviva flows? And it doesn't have a lot of glycerin in it like a tube paint. By the way, if you're a watercolor artist and you're using pan paints and you're not getting a nice flow in a big wash like this, it's because there's not a lot of glycerin in the pans. So you might want to get at least 1 tube for doing like a big sky or something like that. The only pan paints that have the same amount of glycerin as tubes are Daniel Smith. And they're still harder to work with. So I'm just going to show you, I can keep grabbing that. We'll just let it go all the way down now at this point. It's fine. I'm going to darken up the top of it now because it still needs a little more punch at the top. So I could do 2 things. I could wait for it to dry. Sorry. I could wait for it to dry and wet it again and do it all over, or I can work fast. There's 2 ways of doing it. So I'm gonna grab a little bit of a purple and mix that into my blue and just get a little bit more of a darker color. And the key is for it to be a little thicker than the last wash. Right, Fletcher? Fletcher knows this. If it's a little bit thicker, the chances are you're not gonna get run-ins. And then I'll just fade it out a little bit with some plain run-ins or blossoms and blooms. Normally, like in the studio, I would do this, needs a little more help. I would do this I would let it dry and do it. So I'm gonna use a few sort of earth tones, and I'm gonna leave a little bit more. I'll hold it up in a minute to show you guys. I'm just gonna mix color on the palette a little bit, and I'm gonna leave a little bit of white at the top. I'm gonna have a little more snow in here than is in the actual picture, just for fun. So by leaving a little bit of white at the edge, it shows like snow. I can always put shadow in there if I want. And then I'm blending it down to give it a little more interest. And I just will vary my strokes so they're not all in the same direction. If you find yourself using the same strokes over and over again, just change it up. It gets boring, so just change it. Nobody wants to see the same strokes over and over again because patterns generally like that don't repeat in nature in that way. So just mix it up. Okay. So I can always layer in a bit more thickness. That was the wrong color I mixed. I'm trying to make it darker but also thicker. So you can layer it in a little thicker and you'll get, the color won't spread as much. So this is called painting wet and wet, and you can do what's called drop in some color. So it bleeds softly. And then you have a juxtaposition of crisp edges with softer edges. Probably my favorite thing about watercolor.
I forgot what I was going to ask. A senior moment, sorry.
That's okay, when it comes to you.
Oh, the paints that you used, the Avita, how do you
The
say?
Viviva, yeah.
Yeah, the Avita, is it Gavita?
Velveeta, like the cheese. Yeah.
Anyways, does that dry lighter?
All watercolor dries lighter. All watercolor will dry about 20 to 30% lighter than when you laid it down.
I
So,
didn't know
yes.
that was the same as the others, so.
Yeah, it's just so vivid that you don't notice it as much, but it does, yeah. And so I do take that into account when I'm mixing up the paint and how much water I put in the paint, especially if I'm working with a wet on wet background, because the water in the paper will also dilute the paint. And sometimes I forget that. So for me, if it looks a little bit too dark in my palette, it's probably gonna be just fine, because it will dry a little bit lighter.
If it looks dark, wait a day.
Yeah, this is a good, yeah. And if it looks too light, also wait a day, because waiting is good in watercolor, and it's good with any art, right? Because you gain objectivity over it. We're not objective when we're painting. We're having fun making marks and stuff like that. And so it is a good idea to look at it. I'll look at my stuff a few days later. I'll turn it upside down. I'm very lucky to have a few friends who are very critical, and they're like my art directors, you know. So I'll show them, and they'll be like, "There's a big weird shape in the middle of that. Didn't you notice that?" And, oh no, I didn't notice that. So, you know, it's helpful to have a little bit of space in between when you decide to put a frame on it or something. So I'm just using this brush to make marks, and it's too wet to drop some trees into it, but I will want to put trees in there, and I want to put them in and let them blur a little in the background, because that gives you atmospheric perspective. So I am gonna have some green ready to go, and then when I'm at the right drying time, then I'll know I can just go straight to that green rather than mixing it up when it looks dry enough, and then it will dry too fast. So I'm gonna start using this neutral buff, I guess. And start just working my way down here a little bit. So a lot of people ask me, oh, how do you know about mixing your colors? And I have had the pretty much same palette of colors for maybe 3 years, I think. And so I know how to mix all of them with each other. So when you start off, it can be difficult because you don't know what a color looks like mixed with another color. You might barely know what that color looks like on its own, you know? So if you keep your palette limited, then it's easier to discover how to mix things together. And then you can also add or subtract colors to your palette based on maybe a new color that you want in the mix. So if you start using a lot of purple, or maybe you have a commission or something you've been meaning to paint, you know. then you can always throw in an extra color. But I find it's easier to figure out how to combine colors if you're using a limited number of them and you're using the same ones. So I'm just gonna scumble this because we don't have a lot of time and I like to do that anyway.
Having too much fun.
Yeah, it's too much, it is a lot of fun to scumble too. So scumbling is just when you sort of let your brush dance over the paper. And you can maybe push it down even. So I wanted to capture this. It's like a waterfall here. It might be a waterfall actually. So I'm just leaving some vertical strokes in here. And I'm not being literal to the painting because absolutely no one is going to say there wasn't a patch of snow right there when I was there, right? When you're landscape painting, there's some things you might want to catch. Like I painted Crystal Crag once up in Mammoth Mountain at Lake Mary, and someone said like, nope, that's not, you just didn't get it. And they were right, you know? And so if they weren't going to buy it, you know, but if you were painting it to sell it, you would want to get that crystal peak just right. But if you're not doing it for that reason, then you can take a whole lot of liberties. So I've got my green ready. And I'm gonna start dropping in. Ooh, I need a little more of this. I'm gonna start dropping in some greens here because there's some vegetation down here. And I just like to make marks with the brush. I'm never gonna paint a tree, like a literal tree. It's not gonna happen. So boring to me. Once I have to start doing that, I'm out. I'm just out, I'm done. Like I don't, you know, I do that when I do my pet portraits and that's enough of being literal for me, really. And even then I take some liberties. So it does look like the animal when I'm done, but that tree again doesn't have to look like that specific tree. That's something no tree has ever come up to me and said, make me look younger. So, so I literally just use the different brush at hand. I'm using a lot of this brush because I like it, but you can use the different brushes at hand to create these different shapes. And people always ask me, how did you get that to be so abstract? And I'm like, well, I don't wear my glasses when I'm doing this. But people who have better eyesight than I do, they might squint a little bit. Squinting is good. If you think you're being too literal, just squint a little bit because the squinting takes that literalness out. I do think that if you want to abstract things, some people can just do it naturally, and for the rest of us, I would say just squint. You could have a glass of wine too. That works too. From what I hear, from what I understand, that works too. So I'm going to put a little bit of color in here where I have these white spaces because there's color in the mountains as well as snow in the mountains. So it's a little dull in there. I'll crisp it up. The mountains that are further away should have less detail than the ones that are close up, and we've got the opposite here right now. It's okay. It's like that camera lens that's opposite that zooms in on the background, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. Artists can break the rules. But I'm going to put, maybe that's too dark. I'm going to put a little bit of these colors. Sorry, mixing up a terrible color. I'm going to put a little bit of that in here. So there's some hint of the reflection of the mountains. And then this side was a little more gray. It's not perfect, but I'll get it in there. And it'll be good enough for now. Good enough, yeah. Again, more abstract. So you can either put the water down first and let it bleed, or you can put the paint down and then take a little bit of water and bleed out the edge. And that water will sort of pull it down like osmosis. And this is dry down here, so it won't give us any troubles. But I'll do it right here. Just sort of tickle the edge, and it will bleed down like that. Thank you. So it just needs to get darkened up a little bit over here. I don't want to be too finicky with it, so I'll just do a little bit of it. You guys see a little bit of what I'm doing? So if I were to continue this, I could kind of create a little bit of dark texture on top of the lightness. And then you get that soft combination, darks and lights, but with some of the light showing through. That's the trick with watercolor, is let some of those previous layers shine through a little bit. Because otherwise you're just covering everything up, you know? And you can scumble it a little bit. But just let some bits show through. I don't know what I'm painting because I'm upside down. But also the soft edge and the hard edge is quite nice as a juxtaposition. So I think it needs maybe like a little bit more work, but not much. I like to kind of keep it loose, but I would probably do a little bit more, just a little bit more in here. Maybe like right at the base here, it needs a little something to define it. And usually I'll look at it the next day and decide if it needs more. Sometimes it needs less, and I'll lift some things up. So anyway, the real magic comes when you take off the tape, right? Because the tape, in a way, is very distracting, because the tape adds a value, a mid-value to your painting that is not going to be there when you take it off, right? Which is not something that people who work on canvases, I think, have to think about very often, but watercolorists do think about this. So see the difference when you take the tape off, then you get to see kind of what it's really going to look like. So yeah, thank you for letting me do that demonstration today. And thank you. Thanks for all your great questions. You're welcome.